January 14th, 1952, 3:47 a.m. Sing Sing Correctional Facility, D Block. The temperature inside Bumpy Johnson's cell had dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit. His breath came out in frozen clouds. His fingers were numb. Outside, a winter storm was battering New York with temperatures at 8 below zero. And inside D Block, the heating system that was supposed to keep 200 men from freezing to death had been deliberately shut off. The man who turned that valve wasn't some sadistic guard looking for kicks. It was Chief Guard Malcolm Hendricks, a 20-year veteran of the prison system, a man known for running the tightest, most disciplined cell block in the entire state of New York. And he'd shut off the heat for one reason: to break Bumpy Johnson. What Hendricks didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that in trying to break one man, he was about to trigger the most coordinated prison rebellion Sing Sing had ever seen. A revolt that wouldn't involve a single weapon, a single punch, or a single drop of blood, but would bring the entire facility to its knees in less than 48 hours. To understand what happened in D Block that January, you need to understand why Bumpy Johnson was in Sing Sing in the first place. By 1951, Bumpy had become too powerful in Harlem. The NYPD couldn't touch him through normal means. He had judges on payroll, politicians in his pocket, and enough lawyers to tie up any case for years. So they got creative. They brought in federal charges: conspiracy to distribute narcotics across state lines. The trial was a setup from day one, but it didn't matter. The government needed Bumpy off the streets, and they got what they wanted. 15 years in Sing Sing. No parole eligibility for 7. When Bumpy arrived at Sing Sing in March 1951, Chief Guard Hendricks was waiting for him. Hendricks had read Bumpy's file. He knew about the numbers racket, the protection schemes, the network of loyalty that stretched across Harlem. And Hendricks had one rule about men like Bumpy: break them early or they'll run your prison. That first day, Hendricks pulled Bumpy aside in the processing area. "Let me make something clear, Johnson. I don't care who you were on the outside. In here, you're inmate 24/7/81. You follow my rules. You keep your head down. You do your time quietly. Do that, and we'll get along fine." Bumpy looked at Hendricks with those calculating eyes that had stared down mob bosses and corrupt cops, and he said 5 words that set everything in motion: "I don't take orders well." Over the next 10 months, Bumpy and Hendricks engaged in a careful dance. Bumpy never broke the rules. He never gave Hendricks a reason to throw him in solitary. But he also never submitted. He walked D Block like he walked the streets of Harlem, with quiet authority. Other inmates gravitated toward him. When fights broke out, Bumpy would step in and settle them with a word. When guards tried to shake down prisoners for commissary money, those guards would find their car tires slashed in the parking lot. Nothing could be traced back to Bumpy, but Hendricks knew. By January 1952, Hendricks had had enough. He needed to remind Bumpy Johnson that in Sing Sing there was only one king, and it wasn't an inmate from Harlem. That's when Hendricks learned about the heating system in D Block. The prison's heating was controlled by a central boiler, but each cell block had its own secondary valve system. Hendricks could shut off heat to individual blocks without affecting the rest of the prison. And with a brutal cold snap forecasted for mid-January, Hendricks saw his opportunity. January 13th, 1952, 11 p.m. Hendricks walked down to the basement maintenance room. The night shift engineer, a man named Pete Kowalski, was reading a newspaper and drinking coffee. "Pete," Hendricks said, his voice casual, "I need you to shut off the heat to D Block." Kowalski looked up, confused. "Sir? It's supposed to hit 5 below tonight. Those men will freeze." "That's the point," Hendricks said coldly. "We've got an inmate who needs to learn some humility. 24 hours without heat, maybe 48. When he's begging for a blanket, he'll remember who runs this place." "But sir," Kowalski protested, "that's 200 men. You can't punish an entire block because of one guy." Hendricks leaned in close. "I can do whatever I want, and if you've got a problem with that, I can have you transferred to night watch at the women's facility upstate. Your choice." Kowalski shut off the valve. By 2 a.m., the temperature in D Block had dropped 15 degrees. By 4 a.m., men were huddled under thin prison blankets, shivering. By 6 a.m., when breakfast came, prisoners were banging on their cell bars, demanding answers. Bumpy Johnson sat on his bunk, watching, listening, thinking. He knew exactly what this was. Hendricks was making a move, and like every move made against him, Bumpy was going to turn it into a lesson. At 7:30 a.m., during the morning yard time, Bumpy gathered a group of men near the basketball court. There were 8 of them. Tommy, the broker Williams, a former stockbroker doing time for embezzlement. Marcus Steady Reed, a numbers runner from Brooklyn. Giuseppe Joe Hooks, Catalano, a connected guy from the Bronx. Leroy Washington, a boxer who'd killed a man in the ring. Andre Baptiste, a Haitian immigrant who spoke 5 languages. Samuel Cross, a Harlem preacher convicted of fraud. Robert Books Taylor, the prison's most educated inmate, former teacher, and Frank Delaney, an Irish dock worker with union connections. These men represented every faction in D-Block. Different backgrounds, different crimes, different allegiances, but they all respected Bumpy. "Hendricks shut off our heat," Bumpy said quietly. "He's trying to break me. But here's what he doesn't understand. When you try to break one man by punishing 200, you don't break that one man. You unite the 200. Tommy the broker spoke up. "So what are you suggesting? A riot? Guards will put that down in 10 minutes. We'll be in solitary for months." "No riot," Bumpy said. "No violence, no weapons. Hendricks wants to freeze us out? We're going to freeze him out." "How?" asked Marcus Reed. Bumpy smiled. "By doing absolutely nothing." For the next 30 minutes, Bumpy laid out a plan that was so simple, so elegant, so perfectly calculated that even the skeptics had to admire it. They were going to stage a complete work stoppage. No violence, no threats, just total non-cooperation. But it had to be coordinated perfectly. Here's how it would work. Every inmate in D-Block would refuse all work assignments. No kitchen duty, no laundry, no maintenance, no manufacturing. They would attend head count. They would stay in their cells when required. They would follow every official rule. But they would not work. And without D-Block's labor, Sing Sing's daily operations would collapse. You see, the guards didn't run the prison. The inmates did. Inmates cooked the food. Inmates cleaned the facilities. Inmates did the laundry, operated the workshop machinery, maintained the grounds. Without inmate labor, the prison would grind to a halt in 48 hours. But Bumpy's plan had a twist. D-Block wouldn't just stop working. They would maintain perfect discipline. No fights, no arguments, no contraband. They would be model prisoners in every way except one. They wouldn't work until the heat came back on. The beauty of this approach was psychological. Hendricks could justify shutting off heat as a disciplinary measure. But how could he justify punishing men for not working when they were technically following all other rules? How could he throw 200 men into solitary confinement when they weren't being violent or disruptive? The system would have to acknowledge that Hendricks had created the problem. At 9 a.m., the work call went out. In D-Block, 200 men sat in their cells. Guards walked the tiers, shouting orders. Work call, kitchen detail, report to the mess hall. Manufacturing crew, report to the workshop. Laundry team, let's move. Nobody moved. Guard Thompson, a young officer on his 3rd month, approached Bumpy's cell. "Johnson, you're on kitchen detail. Let's go." "I'm not feeling well," Bumpy said calmly. "I think I need to see the medical unit." Thompson frowned. "You look fine to me." "Then I guess I'm staying here," Bumpy replied. "You refusing a direct order?" Thompson's voice rose. "I'm not refusing anything," Bumpy said evenly. "I'm sick. I need medical attention. If you want to write me up for being sick, that's your choice." Thompson moved to the next cell. "Reed, you're on laundry." Reed looked up from his bunk. "Can't do it, boss. My back went out last night. All this cold, you know. Must have pulled something." Thompson's face reddened. He moved down the line. Same response from every cell. "I'm sick. I pulled a muscle. I've got a headache. I need to see medical." Not one man refused outright. Not one man gave Thompson a reason to use force. They were simply too unwell to work. By 10 a.m., Chief Guard Hendricks was standing in D-Block, staring at 200 men who had suddenly developed mysterious ailments. He knew exactly what was happening. "Johnson!" Hendricks shouted. "Get out here!" Bumpy walked to his cell bars, moving slowly like a man in pain. "Yes, sir?" "You started this," Hendricks said coldly. "I didn't start anything," Bumpy replied. "I woke up not feeling well. Seems like a lot of other men aren't feeling well either. Maybe it's the cold." "You think you're clever?" Hendricks said, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can play games with me?" "I'm not playing games, sir," Bumpy said respectfully. "I'm just trying to get through my sentence. But I've got to tell you, it's hard to sleep when it's 30 degrees in your cell. It's hard to work when your fingers are numb. It's hard to follow orders when you're wondering if you're going to get frostbite." Hendricks stared at Bumpy for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of D Block. By noon, the prison administration was in crisis mode. The kitchen was understaffed. Only inmates from A, B, and C blocks had reported for duty, and they couldn't handle the workload alone. Lunch was 2 hours late. The laundry wasn't running. 3,000 inmates throughout the facility were running out of clean uniforms. The workshop had shut down completely. The prison's manufacturing contracts, which generated revenue for the state, were falling behind schedule. Warden Robert Sullivan called an emergency meeting with his senior staff. "What the hell is happening in D Block?" Sullivan demanded. Chief Guard Hendricks stood at attention. "It's Johnson, sir. He's orchestrated a work stoppage. The whole block is claiming they're too sick to work." "So throw them in solitary," Sullivan said. "We can't, sir," replied Captain Morris, the head of prison operations. "They're not breaking any rules. They're not being violent. They're not refusing orders. They're just sick." "All of them? At the same time?" Sullivan's voice was incredulous. "It's coordinated," Morris admitted, "but we can't prove it. And if we start punishing men for being sick, especially when it's 30 degrees in their cells, we're going to have a legal nightmare. The ACLU will be all over us." Sullivan turned to Hendricks. "Why is it 30 degrees in D Block?" Hendricks hesitated. "I shut off the heat, sir." "As a disciplinary measure? Against 1 man or 200? Sullivan asked coldly. Silence. Sullivan slammed his hand on the desk. "Turn the heat back on. Now." "Sir, if we give in," Hendricks protested, "we lose all authority." "We've already lost authority," Sullivan shouted. "We've got 200 men who figured out how to shut down this facility without throwing a single punch. That's not a security failure. That's a command failure. Turn the heat on." At 2 p.m., the valve in the basement was reopened. Warm air began flowing back into D Block. By 3 p.m., the temperature had risen to 55 degrees. By 4 p.m., it was 65. At 4:30 p.m., Guard Thompson walked through D Block. "Work call for tomorrow morning. Kitchen detail, laundry, workshop. Everyone reports." One by one, inmates nodded. "Sure thing, boss." "No problem. Feeling much better now." Tommy the broker whispered to Marcus Reed as Thompson walked past. "That's it. We won." Reed smiled. "Bumpy doesn't win battles. He teaches lessons." That night, Bumpy sat in his cell writing a letter. Not to a lawyer, not to an associate on the outside, but to his daughter. He wrote about choices, about power, about how the strongest move isn't always the loudest one. The next morning, D Block reported for work. Every man, every assignment. The prison returned to normal operations as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. Chief Guard Hendricks never tried to discipline Bumpy Johnson again. In fact, Hendricks requested a transfer to a different facility 3 months later. The official reason was personal. The real reason was that he couldn't walk through D Block without feeling the weight of his failure. Word of the D Block freeze spread through the prison system. Bumpy Johnson had done something nobody thought possible. He'd won a fight without fighting. He'd staged a rebellion without violence. He'd brought a maximum security prison to its knees through perfect coordination and discipline. But here's what most people miss about that story. Bumpy didn't win because he was tough. He didn't win because he was connected. He won because he understood something fundamental about power. Real power isn't about domination. It's about unity. Hendricks tried to break 1 man by punishing 200. Bumpy united those 200 men by giving them a common enemy and a common goal. And in that unity, they became unbreakable. Bumpy served 4 more years at Sing Sing before being transferred to a federal facility. In those 4 years, D Block ran smoother than any other cell block in the prison. Fewer fights, fewer incidents, fewer problems. Why? Because Bumpy had proven that when men work together, when they maintain discipline, when they choose their battles carefully, they have more power than any guard, any warden, any system. When Bumpy was released in 1963, he returned to Harlem as a legend. Not just for what he'd done on the streets, but for what he'd done behind bars. The story of the D Block freeze became one of those tales that got told in barbershops and pool halls. The time Bumpy Johnson turned a heating valve into a revolution. Chief Guard Hendricks learned that day what a lot of powerful men eventually learn. You can control a man's circumstances, but you can't control his mind. And when a man's mind is sharper than your authority, when his strategy is better than your force, you've already lost. The temperature in D Block that January dropped to 34 degrees. but the lesson Bumpy taught burned hot enough to warm 200 men through a winter storm. And that heat, that unity, that perfect execution of strategic resistance, that's something no guard could ever shut off. Look, if this story got you thinking, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Could you have held together 200 men without violence? Could you have turned a punishment into a victory? And if you want to hear more about how Bumpy Johnson played chess while everyone else played checkers, hit subscribe because we're dropping these stories every week. Next time, we're talking about the day Bumpy walked into a sit-down with 5 mob families and walked out with immunity. You're not going to want to miss that. Remember, power isn't about who hits hardest. It's about who thinks furthest ahead. And in January 1952, Bumpy Johnson was thinking so far ahead that Chief Guard Hendricks never saw the checkmate coming.